Stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Leng. Thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a while since I dissected a deck in the meta, and I thought it would be interesting to take a look at one particular archetype that I've been fairly critical of in the past. These are the decks that I like to refer to as the Rogue Overachievers, which are based on the Succeed by 2 mechanic that is particular to that class. This is part 1 of a 2-part episode. In part 1, we'll take a closer look at the Rogue class, some of the key cards in the Overachiever archetype, as well as some of the math behind the deck, which is critical to understanding the archetype success. In part 2, we'll pit a Rogue Overachiever deck against a scenario from the Dunwich Legacy cycle so you can get a better idea of how the deck plays and some of its strengths and weaknesses. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. So with that warning, let's get started. So why Rogues? Well, for those of you who have been following my Mythos Pack reviews, you'll remember that I haven't had a lot of positive things to say about the Succeed by 2 archetype in general and the level 2 versions of Switchblade and Opportunist in particular. Those cards were released in the Essex County Express and Undimensioned and Unseen respectively, and my review of the latter card caused at least one viewer to leap to the archetype's defense. Kevin Crooks wrote in the comments section, "All those people you've talked to about the Success by 2 decks are mistaken. I love it. It's fun, it's good if built and piloted well. Maybe missing a piece or two, but damn successful." Well, I'm here to tell you that I was wrong and Kevin is right. I've been playing around with the Rogue Overachiever archetype for the past few weeks, and I think it is a viable build to explore if you enjoy playing the Rogue class. Now, it does have some flaws, which we'll look at in more detail later in this episode, but the deck can be effective if you take the time to understand the mechanics and the math behind it. So what are the key cards to the Rogue Overachiever archetype? Well, there are 3. The 41 Derringer from the core set, the level 2 version of Switchblade from the Essex County Express, and the level 2 version of Opportunist from Undimensioned and Unseen. These are the cornerstones of the archetype, which is essentially an elaborate combat-oriented combo at the moment. The goal is to get your 41 Derringer or Switchblade into play and a copy or 2 of Opportunist in your hand. Once you've got the combo set up, you attempt to pull it off each combat, pitching the Opportunist to the combat skill test in order to succeed by 2. If you're successful, you can pull the copy or copies of Opportunist back into your hand so you're ready to pull off the combo again. With any luck, you can keep this trick going indefinitely, hopefully leaving a pile of dead enemies in your wake. Now, while the combo is limited to combat for the time being, it seems likely that the designers will expand it to include other facets of the game, such as investigation or evasion. Now, you'll notice I left 2 cards off the list, the level 0 versions of Switchblade and Opportunist, both of which were released in the core set. I think both of those cards are really quite bad, and if you're serious about playing the archetype, you're going to need to spend the 8 experience points to upgrade to their level 2 versions. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself seriously outgunned as the difficulty of the scenarios increase. And the rest of the video assumes that you have upgraded to those 2 cards. Besides the 41 Derringer and the level 2 version of Switchblade and Opportunist, you've got a couple of options to include in your Overachiever deck. Since you're attempting to succeed skill tests by 2, you might consider including a copy or 2 of Quick Thinking in your deck, a rogue skill card from Undimensioned and Unseen. Quick Thinking rewards you with an extra action if the skill test is successful by 2 or more. Obviously, picking up an extra action here or there is extremely powerful, especially if you're at the make or break point of a scenario. However, it's not essential to pulling off the combo, and it only has 1 wild icon, and pulling off this combo consistently requires a lot of icons, which makes it a weaker choice than cards with 2 or 3 icons. The second card you might want to consider is Sure Gamble, an event from the core set. Sure Gamble lets you switch a token's negative modifier to a positive modifier, which can be very helpful if you're attempting to overachieve on skill tests. Now, I've tested the archetype both with and without Sure Gamble, and it's definitely worth considering as the scenarios become more challenging. As we'll see shortly, one of the archetype's key weaknesses is that it doesn't scale particularly well with the combat value of monsters, and Sure Gamble is one of the few ways to help pull off the combo as the difficulty of skill tests ramps up. The final card worth considering for the archetype is Lucky Dice, an asset from Undimensioned and Unseen. Lucky Dice enables you to ignore a Chaos token you just pulled and reveal another, which can turn a failure into a success. At 4 experience points, Lucky Dice is a cheaper option than a pair of Sure Gambles, which will cost you 6 experience. But unlike Sure Gamble, it's impossible to guarantee that the second or third token you reveal will push you over the Succeed by 2 threshold. It's important to note that Lucky Dice also received an errata in the recent FAQ, so as with Sure Gamble, you can't use it if you pull the tentacle first. Once you understand the key cards behind the archetype, the next step is to pick an investigator to play with. There are currently 3 choices: Skids O'Toole, Jenny Barnes, and Wendy Adams. Skids and Jenny are the best choices, I think, for an overachiever deck. While you could build an overachiever deck around Wendy, she only has 1 combat icon currently, which makes it that much more difficult to pull off the combo consistently. Besides, Wendy has better combat options in Baseball Bat, Double or Nothing, and Backstab if you want to go that route. If you're interested in exploring some of Wendy's combat options, check out the other videos on my channel that focus on her, and you can get a better idea of how that combo deck works. Now, forced to choose between Skids and Jenny, Jenny's probably the better choice. It all boils down to the extra resource she generates every turn. The overachiever archetype does place a heavy demand on your resource pool, and Jenny's extra resource can help ease that burden, while Skids' extra action does not. One thing to keep in mind if you're planning to build a deck around the archetype is that you're going to need to commit a fair number of experience points to make it work. You're going to need at least 8 for the combo, possibly another 4 to 6 for Lucky Dice or a pair of Sure Gambles as the campaign progresses. And that doesn't include the 4 experience you'll want to spend on key permanents such as Adaptable from the Miskatonic Museum and Streetwise from Blood on the Altar. That doesn't leave you with a lot of experience points left to shore up Skids or Jenny's willpower if they rack up a few mental trauma during the campaign, and both investigators are extremely vulnerable to sustaining mental trauma, whether it's the result of seeing one too many rotting remains or Jenny's signature weakness, searching for Izzy. So what does an overachiever deck look like? Now, when I'm building a deck for a campaign, I find it helpful to build the deck that I want to play, that is, the one that includes the cards that cost experience points, and then work backward from there. If you do that, A, you'll have a pretty good idea how much experience you'll need to create the deck. B, you'll have a pretty good idea whether you can earn that much experience, especially if this is your second time through a campaign. And C, you can visualize the changes you need to make to the deck as you gain the experience. With that in mind, I've created a couple of examples of overachiever decks. Both are available over at Arkham DB if you want to take a closer look at them. The Skids deck is an iteration of the Cutman Skids deck, which was posted by BD Flory, while the Jenny deck is an iteration of Felagun's solo deck that he posted on Arkham DB. As you can see, there are a lot of similarities between the two decks. Both require 12 experience points to build, and they include 2 copies of the level 0 41 Derringer, 2 copies of the level 2 Switchblade, 2 copies of the level 2 Opportunist, as well as Adaptable and Streetwise. Now you could probably get away without the Streetwise earlier in some of the scenarios in the campaign, but I think you'll need it, especially for where doom awaits. Both decks include physical training to shore up their combat and willpower tests. Neither of these decks contains Sure Gamble, which would raise the number of experience points required to build them to 18. Now, the original Jenny deck contained 2 copies of Machete, which I removed because I wanted the deck to focus on the Succeed by 2 mechanic. I added a couple of copies of Quick Thinking to be in keeping with the Succeed by 2 theme, but they could certainly be exchanged for something else, like the Machetes if you wanted to have a little bit more reliable combat, or a card like, say, Inquiring Mind from the Seeker class, which gives you those 3 wild icons, which will help you pass tests. So if you've worked up the courage to build an Overachiever deck, how do they work in practice? To find that out, we need to do some math, since the success or failure of the Overachiever deck really hinges on the temperament of the Chaos Bag. Now here's a chart for Blood on the Altar scenario in standalone mode. The column on the left is where you're sitting before the pull from the Chaos Bag, while the column on the right is your chance of pulling off the combo. In the case of the 41 Derringer and the level 2 version of Switchblade, that means you're going to hit the enemy for +1 damage, and if you've committed the level 2 version of Opportunist to the skill test, you'll get to take that back into your hand, so you can repeat the process. Now, these numbers aren't entirely accurate, since pulling a tablet in the hidden chamber means you have to pull another token, and it's difficult to predict what the result of that will be. However, you can see from the chart that if you're hoping to pull off the combo consistently, you really need to be sitting at +4, +5, or +6 before you pull from the Chaos Bag. Now, an Opportunist or 2 will get you part of the way, but you'll probably need to find some other way of boosting your skill. That means pitching cards with combat icons on them, or spending resources on talents like Hard Knocks or Physical Training. If you're pitching Opportunists to the test, it's better to aim higher than lower, since you don't get to pull them back into your hand if you fail the test. In my experience, +5 seems to be right most of the time. It's not too difficult to consistently hit +5 if you've got an Opportunist in hand, although you could aim for +4 earlier in their scenario when the skulls and tablets aren't quite so harsh. So how does this compare to an investigator armed with a machete? The table on the left illustrates the chance of doing +1 damage with the 41 Derringer or the Switchblade, while the one on the right is the machete. As you can see, it's easier to do +1 damage with the machete. Your odds are pretty good if you're sitting at +2 or +3 before the pull. Hell, early in the scenario, you've still got a roughly 50% chance of doing +1 damage if you're only sitting at +1. Now, that's certainly not the case with either the 41 Derringer or the Switchblade, which need to be sitting at +3 before they've got 50-50 odds. Pulling off the combo requires extra cards and resources, and that's why Opportunist is so important to keeping it running. Now, the Switchblade does give you, and the 41 Derringer for that matter, do give you a bigger combat bonus over Machete, which is one of their advantages. Now, as the contents of the Chaos Bag are important to determining whether you can pull off the combo consistently, the enemies in the encounter deck are also an important factor to consider before you sleeve up an Overachiever deck, because it's the enemies that determine how many times you need to pull off the combo in any given scenario. Fortunately, most of the enemies in Blood on the Altar don't put up a lot of pressure on the Overachiever decks. Skids and Jenny both have a combat value of 5 while equipped with the 41 Derringer or the level 2 Switchblade. If you're aiming for +5 before the pull, you don't need to pitch anything to kill the Whippoorwills. while you'll need to pitch an Opportunist plus a card or resource to take down the mobster if you happen to add him to the encounter deck during a campaign. Defeating the Servant of Many Mouths will require an Opportunist and 2 cards or resources. In the case of the latter 2 enemies, you will need to pull off the combo only once. However, there are a couple of enemies that will put significantly more pressure on the deck. Killing an O'Banion's Thug, for example, will require an Opportunist and 3 cards or resources, while the Night Gaunt will require an Opportunist plus 2 cards and resources, and you'll need to pull off that combo twice, so you're probably looking at an Opportunist and 4 cards and resources. Silas Bishop ups the ante, of course, as you would expect for a boss, forcing you to pull off the combo 3 times at a cost of an Opportunist and 2 cards and resources. Now 6 cards or resources is a fair chunk of change to pay out, so you're going to need to do some hoarding earlier in the scenario so you're prepared to deal with Silas when the time comes. Now again, it's important to remember that these numbers are assuming that you're aiming for +5 before the pull. You might be able to get away with pitching fewer cards and resources if you're aiming for, say, +3 or +4, but you need to remember that your chance of pulling off the combo consistently will decrease if you're aiming for those numbers. Examining the Chaos Bag and the enemies in Blood on the Altar sheds a little bit of light on some of the underlying weaknesses of the Overachiever deck. First, they're expensive in terms of cards and resources. Opportunist helps mitigate this problem somewhat, but you're still going to chew through a fair number of cards and resources to keep the combo going over the course of the game. Opportunist creates some problems of its own. If you want to pitch it to a test, you really need to be succeeding by 2, even if only if you need to do 1 point of damage with your Derringer or Switchblade. This can put you in an awkward situation when fighting enemies with odd health totals like 3 or 5. Suddenly those Opportunists in your hand can feel like a liability, forcing you to spend cards and resources that aren't really necessary to pass the test. The second problem with the Overachiever decks is that, like most combo-oriented decks, they can be extremely fragile. The deck can hum along nicely if the combo is working, but if you fail a test and lose your Opportunists, which is always a possibility given the nature of the Chaos Bag, the deck becomes much more challenging to pilot. Coming up with an extra card or resource to replace the Opportunist you would have pitched to a test is going to add up extremely fast. The third problem with the deck is that it doesn't scale particularly well as the difficulty of the scenarios increases, and you don't have to look any further than Where Doom Awaits for an example of this. As you can see from the chart, the Chaos Bag in Where Doom Awaits makes it more difficult to keep the combo up and running. If you were sitting at +5 before the pull in Blood on the Altar, your chances of succeeding could be as high as 88.89%. In Where Doom Awaits, your chance of success dips to 73.68%. If you're at +6 before the pull in Where Doom Awaits, you still only have about a 78.95% chance of success, compared with 94.44% in Blood on the Altar. And these numbers don't factor in the Cultist token, which will blank your Opportunists, which could be absolutely terrible, or the Elder Thing token, which could be a very high negative number depending on the cards in your deck, since you need to discard the top 2 cards of your deck and add up the costs. The enemies in Where Doom Awaits compound the problem caused by the Chaos Bag. Many of them have high combat and health values, which requires more cards and resources to overcome. Now, the Thrall is relatively benign, but the Devotee of the Key and the Lupine Thrall will set you back about 4 to 6 resources, respectively. Theoretically, you only need to pull off the combo once against those enemies, but you might end up having to do it twice if you're planning to use Opportunists during those tests. That's not the case with the Crazed Shoggoth, which requires an Opportunist and roughly 6 cards or resources to take down. Fortunately, there's only one of those in the deck, so your chance of encountering him is slim, and God forbid you encounter the Avian Thrall armed with a level 2 Switchblade rather than your trusty Derringer. If you're playing in the campaign, the Servant of the Lurker could require as many as 9 cards and resources, which is a lot to ask from any investigator. Now, between the difficulty of the Chaos Bag and the more challenging enemies, an Overachiever deck is going to struggle in Where Doom Awaits. And I don't think there's an easy solution to this problem in the current card pool. Cards like Sure Gamble and Lucky Dice may help you overcome the enemy's higher combat values. However, they really don't help you with the resource issue. You might consider adding a Hot Streak to the deck to remedy that, but that's going to be an extra 4 to 8 experience you might not be able to afford, depending how things are going in your campaign. So where Achievers decks stand in the grand scheme of things? Well, I would never argue that it's a Tier 1 archetype, but I don't think it's binder fodder either. The deck performed a lot better during testing than I thought it would, and it can be a lot of fun to play once you get the combo rolling. Of course, Tentacles will make you very sad, but that's going to be the case with any deck that's pulling tokens from the Chaos Bag. Personally, I had a lot of success with the archetype against Blood on the Altar. I also tested it against Where Doom Awaits, though, and those games didn't go very well. Part of the problem with that scenario is that it forces you to rely heavily on Streetwise to pass intellect tests at the base of the hill, which saps your resources you need to fuel the combo. Draw the wrong enemy at the wrong time, and you'll quickly find yourself caught in a downward spiral, bleeding resources and cards faster than you can generate them. That suggests to me the archetype isn't quite there yet, and I would certainly agree with Kevin Crooks that it's missing a few key pieces, but I'm not sure what the missing pieces of the puzzle are either. Obviously, a better weapon that boosts your combat skill and does more damage would help. Skids does have access to the level 2 version of Vicious Blow from Lost in Time of Space to pump out a little more damage. Who knows, maybe we'll see a level 5 version of Switchblade that adds to your combat and damage. I would have liked to have seen a second wild icon on the level 2 version of Opportunist to help alleviate some of those problems. But it is what it is, and the card's out now, so I don't think we'll be seeing another version of that. So perhaps there'll be another card released that provides more wild icons. It might be nice to have a card that could retrieve Opportunist from the discard pile in the event the combo goes south. I'm thinking something like the Survivor card Try and Try Again from Lost in Time and Space, although I have my doubts that the designers would go that route, considering Opportunist will already return to your hand if you're successful during the test. Providing a card that would return it to your hand if you're unsuccessful seems like that might be just too overpowered. Perhaps we'll see an investigator at some point who receives some type of bonus from succeeding by 2, or benefits in some way from succeeding by 2, and that would be pretty cool. That would give us some more room to explore in terms of deck building. Like I said, I'm not sure what the answer is, but I am looking forward to seeing how the archetype grows with each new expansion. The Succeed by 2 stipulation is cropping up on more cards, including a few outside the rogue class. So that tells me the designers have a few more tricks up their sleeves as the game progresses. I hope you enjoyed this look at the Overachiever archetype. If you're interested in exploring the archetype further, I hope you'll join me over in Part 2, where I will take a look at the Jenny Barnes version of the deck and put it up against Blood in the Altar. It should be a great game. That's going to do it for me today. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it if you could leave me a thumbs up. It helps the channel a great deal. Do you agree or disagree, or just want to chat about this great game? Maybe you've let me know how if you've had any success with the Succeed by 2 mechanic. Leave me a comment down below. I always enjoy chatting with you all about the game. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to be notified of future content. If you want to reach me, I can be reached at manfromlang@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromlang. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.